The police sirens cut through the morning air as Margaret Thompson pointed her manicured finger at the tall black man standing on what she believed was her front lawn. "Officer, this man is trespassing on my property," she declared, her voice sharp with authority. But as the man slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys that gleamed in the sunlight, something in Margaret's confident expression began to crack. What she didn't know was that she had been living illegally in this man's mansion for 2 weeks, and her world was about to crumble. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine driveway of 1247 Oakwood Manor, but the peaceful scene was shattered by the sound of Margaret Thompson's voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You don't belong here," she shouted from the front steps of the grand mansion, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light as she waved her phone in the air. "I'm calling the police right now." David Williams stood perfectly still on the cobblestone walkway, his broad shoulders relaxed despite the storm brewing before him. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had faced far worse than an angry neighbor. His dark eyes remained calm, almost gentle, as he watched Margaret pace back and forth on what she believed was her own front porch. Margaret had moved into the mansion 2 weeks ago, convinced by a fraudulent rental listing that had used stolen photos of the property. The scammer had taken her deposit and first month's rent before disappearing, leaving her with fake keys and forged documents. But Margaret, president of the local homeowners association and accustomed to getting her way, had simply assumed the beautiful home was rightfully hers. David had been away on a business trip to Japan, finalizing a deal for his tech company that would bring jobs to hundreds of families in his community. He had worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks straight, his mind focused on the presentation that would secure funding for his nonprofit organization, the same organization that provided free coding classes to underprivileged kids in the neighborhood where he had grown up. As a child, David had lived just 3 miles from this very street, in a cramped apartment where the heat rarely worked and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument from the neighbors. His mother, Sarah, had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table while David studied by candlelight when the electricity was cut off. She had always told him, "Son, success isn't about what you own. It's about how many lives you lift up along the way." Now, 20 years later, David owned not just this mansion but 3 others, along with a successful software company that employed over 200 people. Yet he still drove his mother to church every Sunday in the same modest sedan he had bought 5 years ago. The mansion wasn't a symbol of wealth to him. It was a promise kept to a mother who had sacrificed everything. Margaret's voice grew shriller as she spoke to the emergency dispatcher. "Yes, there's a suspicious black man trying to break into my home. He looks dangerous. Please hurry." She glanced at David, expecting him to run or argue or show some sign of guilt. Instead, he simply stood there, his hands at his sides, waiting. The neighbors began to gather. Mrs. Chun from next door peeked through her curtains. The Johnson family slowed their morning jog to stare. Even a mailman paused his route, sensing the tension that hung in the air like smoke. David thought of his daughter, Zoe, away at college studying to become a doctor. He thought of the scholarship fund he had quietly established in his mother's name. He thought of the countless times he had been in situations exactly like this one, where his presence was questioned, his belonging denied, his very existence treated as a threat. But he also thought of something else. 2 weeks ago, before leaving for Japan, he had installed a new security system, hidden cameras that recorded everything, motion sensors that tracked every movement. A system that would have captured Margaret's illegal entry, her unpacking, her settling into a home that was never hers. The police cars arrived with a screech of tires, and Officer Martinez stepped out, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. Margaret rushed toward him, her words tumbling over each other. "Thank goodness you're here. This man is trying to break into my house. I don't know what he wants, but he won't leave." David slowly reached into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and calm. The gathered crowd held its breath. Margaret stepped behind the officer, her face flushed with righteous anger. "See? He's reaching for something." What David pulled out wasn't a weapon or a threat. It was a simple set of keys, house keys that caught the morning light and gleamed like silver hope. But more than that, it was his phone, already connected to his home security app. "Officer," David said, his voice steady and warm, "I'd like to show you something." The phone screen displayed 2 weeks of footage. Margaret entering through a window she had broken. Margaret moving furniture and hanging her pictures on walls that weren't hers. Margaret eating food from a refrigerator she had never filled, sleeping in a bed she had never bought. The color drained from Margaret's face as the truth unfolded before the growing crowd. The Johnson family stopped jogging altogether. Mrs. Chun stepped onto her porch, her eyes wide with understanding. The mailman shook his head in disbelief. But David wasn't finished. He pulled out a folder from his car, documents that told the real story. Property deeds in his name. Tax records showing 5 years of payments. Insurance documents that proved he had been protecting this home long before Margaret had ever seen it. "The truth has a way of rising to the surface," David said quietly, his eyes meeting Margaret's panicked gaze. "Just like cream and coffee." Officer Martinez studied the evidence, his expression shifting from suspicion to embarrassment to something approaching respect. Margaret tried to speak, to explain, to justify, but the words wouldn't come. The foundation of her assumed authority had crumbled beneath her feet. David turned to the gathered neighbors, his voice carrying across the morning air. "We all make mistakes," he said. "The measure of who we are isn't in our mistakes, but in how we face the truth when it finds us." As Margaret gathered her belongings under the watchful eyes of the officer, David stood in his own doorway, keys finally in the lock where they belonged. The morning sun seemed brighter now, casting new shadows across a neighborhood that would never look at assumptions the same way again. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the lesson lingered in the air like morning mist. Sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger or argument. Sometimes it's simply the quiet, unshakable truth.